The market doesn't know what keeps you up at night. It doesn't know when you want to retire, and it doesn't know how old you are. The simple truth is, the market doesn't care. But if you care, you've tuned into the right place. You're listening to Investor Resources, bringing clarity to the confusing world of finance. Here are your hosts of Investor Resources, Don Creech and Perry Sykes.
I'm Don Creech.
And I'm Perry Sykes, and welcome to the Investor Resources Podcast.
If you're watching this, the odds are very good that either currently or in your past, you have participated in a 401k program or at least IRAs, preparing for the retirement funding, which you know you're going to need. And in the past 4 decades, 401k accounts have basically been a Ron Popeil, set it and forget it.
Correct.
Put your money in every payday, pick a fund, take a look at the list that they give you and throw a dart at it. And over 40 years, been a pretty easy 40 years, few interruptions along the way. But generally, dollar cost averaging through those low periods of the market was a benefit. And you ended up with something you just didn't worry about until you get close to retirement. And then things change. But what's more important today for those who are still working and contributing to 401ks is that the environment for capital markets, for stocks and bonds, has had a material change since COVID shutdown and reinvigorating with all sorts of government largesse and federal funding in the markets. It's just, this is a new world. And all the things that were normally assumed to happen in a standard 401k account just aren't happening the same anymore. This time really looks different than it has for 4 decades.
It really does, and it's important to remember that times do change and economic environments do change, and you do need to alter what you're doing. And if someone is watching your 401k plan and they're just telling you, no, we're still just set it and forget it, nothing changes, buy the dip, everything's fine, everything's just like it always was, it's just not true. Things have changed significantly, and like you said, Don, just the amount of money poured on the U.S. economy is completely unprecedented. We've never seen it before, never seen anything like that happen. And the fallout is going to be long-lived, and it needs to be paid attention to.
So the federal deficit, well, let's start with the federal debt. The federal debt has accelerated substantially because of all the borrowing that was necessary to put money, what looked like free money, into people's pockets. Whether it was households or business, the government was doling out the money, and the Fed was buying anything in the market to keep it propped up. So it was free, except that the government had to borrow money. They're going to have to pay the interest on the borrowed money. And eventually that comes back as taxes to you and me. It's not free. There's nothing free coming out of the government. It's
negative.
They should be banned from using that word.
They should. just because it's let's see, not true. That's the problem with it. Yeah. So
over the last 40 years, a standard approach to 401k investment policy has basically been pretty similar to the standard 60-40 portfolio, or buy if you're just getting started. Let's just buy a good mutual fund with a good track record and hang on there. But there's really a difference based on conditions. So an investor who put $1,000 into a 60-40 portfolio at the end of 81, adjusting for inflation, by the end of 2020, had almost $19,000. Well, adjusted for inflation, that's a heck of a return.
That's nice, you bet.
And there are only 5 years in that whole period where you would have lost money. That's 40 years, 5 bad years. Most of them not so bad because bonds grew in value when stocks were falling in value. That was the normal expected relationship. But if you take a different time period and conditions are different, for instance, in 1965, if you used a 60/40 portfolio and you put $1,000 aside for your child's education, when he ends up in high school, end of high school in 82, your $1,000 is 785.
Ouch.
That's not the assumption that people are making when they put money into their portfolio, whether it's
Nope.
401k or not. And that's partly a function of not recognizing that economic conditions really do change markets. And we need to pay attention to what is happening. Not that you're going to day trade your portfolio in your 401k, but to assume, for instance, that your safety valve is a 10-year or 20-year bond and that you can just live on the interest rates and you'll be fine, which was true in the 80s. I mean, my goodness, you could get a 10-year government bond at 12% in the early 80s. I mean, I had a client at the time, he said, why should I buy anything else? That's better than the 10% return of stock market.
With way less risk. That's right. But that's why it's so important to understand that that time frame is so different for outcomes, and that the mantra that is constantly handed out to investors by advisors is the market always goes up. The market always goes up. And they're talking about extremely long time frames, like not only longer than your investment life, but longer than your physical life. You're not going to live long enough most of the time to see some of these drawdowns work out. It doesn't make any sense. And you need to pay attention to shorter time frames, because you do get these negative outcomes, and you have to do something different, or you're just going to get the negative outcome and say, well, there's nothing that could have been done. There usually is something.
Well, and that often scares people. So if they keep losing money and they quit putting money into their 401k, but if you don't have a program for reviewing how you invest your money, you're going to probably end up in trouble. Now, if you're very young, just getting started, and you really have 40 years, maybe you're going to be okay.
Less concern, yeah.
But when the money gets serious in your late 40s, 50s, and certainly as you approach retirement in your 60s, it makes a big difference on whether or not you're going to sit still and do nothing and just quit taking money out of your account. Live on something else, like Social Security. Hopefully you have a pension, but not too many people do anymore. You need to make an adjustment for how on earth are you going to monitor what's happening, or have a manager in the funds you're selecting that actually has a process that he can explain to you how does he defend against major market drawdown, and how has that worked. The process is what you need to understand. If there's a process, even that can fail you in the very short term, but a disciplined process over time is going to capture the major bottoms and the major tops of markets, giving you some protection on the downside and getting you in after there's some evidence that a market has found enough confidence among investors to move off the bottom and start some longer term growth.
And those are intensely different markets. Those are intensely different environments. And if your advisor handed you a pie chart when you started working with them, they're not going to do that. People assume they're watching out for my money. They're going to do what needs to be done depending on what's going on in the market. And that's just not true. That asset mix is going to stay the same until you tell them to change it. And if you don't tell them to change it, they're just going to keep doing the same thing for as long as they can convince you to leave your money there. So they're not looking out for you. They're not trying to find a way to let that down market destroy all the gains you've had from the previous 10 years, say. They're just going to let it happen and tell you, well, eventually that's going to work out over the long run. So don't you worry about that. It'll all be fine in another decade or two. You've got that much time, right? Because that's all they're going to do. That's what that pie chart's for, to convince you just to sit there and do nothing. And especially these days, that's just not good enough.
The other problem is your own emotions. I mean, you're going to be sitting there looking at core values, and you're going to say, I don't want to do this anymore. Put me in something else. And the question is, well, what else? And if that doesn't work right away, suddenly you're making emotional decisions rather than disciplined decisions based on process.
Right.
You need, if you don't have a fund that can answer those questions for you, or an advisor to the fund that can answer those questions, you need to develop your own process in order to get that done. In fact, we spend a lot of time helping people come to grips with the need to do that on our end of month, or actually beginning of month, webinars. And we have one on the first Saturday of every month. We talk about what needs to be done and what's going on in the market. They're educational. You can learn a lot from them. That's why we do them. You can register for those at our website at iriradio.com. They're free. And if you can't make it on Saturday morning when we do them live, you will get, if you register, you'll get a replay link and you can watch it on your own time.